everyone, welcome back to Keto and Krime and Thought Crime. Today we have one of the cases or occurrences that I have studied for quite a while. This was something that I didn't really hear about until I was maybe in college, and I got involved with some libertarian groups and actually heard about this case as a consequence of that. It is the case of the Ruby Ridge standoff, and we're going to talk about it today on Keto and Krime. But before we dive into that, I want to give a shout out to my wonderful patrons and channel members. If you want to join them, they're down below. They get exclusive material. They get early access to material. There's some free merch involved. We will be getting back to having our monthly hangouts. I know I've been terrible about that here lately, but I promise new year, new beginning, it will all be coming together. I promise. And I really appreciate each and every one of you. If you have not subscribed, I hope today is the day I earn that subscription. Please hit that subscribe bar down below. Also like, comment, share. If you were subscribed, check and make sure you're still subscribed because there's some unsubscribing shenanigans going on. And with that being said, let's delve into the tale of the Ruby Ridge standoff.
Story not long ago, high on a mountain in Idaho, I was living free. I sold a standoff shotgun to a deputy.
In short, Ruby Ridge was a 1992 standoff between a family of 6 people and the entire arsenal of the United States federal government, ATF, FBI, military, all converged on Ruby Ridge, Idaho, which is a mountainous area near the Caribou Ridge, about 50 miles south of the British Columbia border of Canada. So this captured media attention in 1992. And was the talk for many, many months and many years after, because there was a lot of congressional inquiries and hearings based on what happened during this standoff. It also blends in with things like Waco, Oklahoma City, and other standoffs, catastrophes that hit during the early part of the 90s, and is often cited as a reason why right-wing extremists kind of do what they do. It's one of those, remember the Alamo moments, it's remember Ruby Ridge type of environment that goes along with this. There's even a very popular song written about it. I'm going to drop a few clips of that song as we go through the parts here. I hope you enjoy that. And but to really understand Ruby Ridge, we've got to go all the way back to 1970, where a young Green Beret stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina named Randy Weaver met a beautiful young woman named Vicky, who would later be his wife, at a Sears store in nearby Colville, North Carolina. They were immediately smitten with each other and started dating. It was pretty much a whirlwind romance. They were married by 1972 when Randy received his honorable discharge from the United States Army. They then decided to move to Cedar Falls, Iowa, because he had been accepted to the University of Northern Iowa to pursue a degree in criminal justice. His intent was to become a police officer. However, because of, let's just say, influenced by Vicky, he quickly gave up that dream and ended up getting a job at a local John Deere tractor factory and worked there for many years. Their first daughter, Sarah Weaver, was born in 1976. But Vicky Vicky and Randy were always kind of religious people, but they were casual Christians, not unlike anyone else in the United States. But there was a lot of economic turmoil during this time. In the mid 70s, late 70s is where you had the oil shortage, the oil embargoes, the oil shortage. You had the decay of what is known as the Rust Belt beginning. That's that Midwestern region, Ohio, Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, that entire what you would call mid-America factory chain starting to erode. You had a lot of those places, a lot of the factories shutting down and going overseas or just shutting down altogether. You had the whole decay of Flint, Detroit starting at this time, and there was a lot of economic upheaval, and that caused a lot of people to turn to religion to find comfort, and Randy and Vicky were among those. But not only did they turn to the Bible, they also turned to books of the day, very popular books of the day. Among them were James Lindsay's The Late Great Planet Earth, which was written by James Lindsay in 1970, which set out his predictions for the end of the world, including the rise of the new Roman Empire, which he said that would be a United States of Europe type of thing. The then Soviet, because we're right in the middle of the Cold War, Soviet invasion of Israel, the War of Gog and Magog, as it's called in the Bible, and just utter decay of the world, with the United States being taken down with it. This was such a huge bestseller that it went on to spawn several sequels. It's amazing how a book about an imminent Armageddon has sequels. But everyone believed that the 1980s would be the final decade of the entire existence of the world. And Vicky fell head over heels into this book. She became literally the religious leader, and Randy kind of followed her lead. Not only did she delve into The Late Great Planet Earth, she also read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which is in no way a religious book. Ayn Rand was an atheist. She was also one of the more prominent figures of the libertarian movement. But in her book, she shows an overbearing government taking control of business and the open market, the free economy, and destroying it, making America a haven for a welfare state, making it where all the producers are actually put out of business, and then you have takers that take over the world. It's a very grim prediction for the financial future of the United States and the world. And after reading both of those books, as you can imagine, Vicky had a very pessimistic view of world events, especially in the turbulent 1970s. And they really felt that Armageddon was imminent. I mean, just tomorrow was Armageddon. So they really believed that they had to prepare both themselves and their families. They began to become preppers. They started stockpiling canned foods. Vicky got several books on food dehydration and began dehydrating food, canning food. It was their hope to have 2 to 3 years worth of food stored up and ready. They began to stockpile weapons, any weapon and ammunition they could get their hands on. They began to store up. They began to study water purification methods. I mean, think of an episode of Doomsday Preppers. That's what they were doing. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be prepared. Goodness knows this pandemic has made us see that we all need to have at least several months of supplies ready to go. But they believed that they would need years. They also decided to start living a biblical lifestyle, and they met a fellow group of preppers that had the same mindset. They started meeting at a local restaurant, and ironically, and started studying the Bible, particularly Old Testament dietary laws. And they started to not eat pork, not eat shellfish. They followed Old Testament dietary laws to the book. They particularly honed in on the New Testament, the book of Matthew, 24th chapter, 15th verse, which basically describes the abomination of desolation. And there was one line in that verse that really spoke to Vicky and Randy, and it was the one that said, "Those that are in Judea, flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop come down to retrieve anything from their house. It was about this time that their son, in 1978, their son Samuel was born, and right after his birth, the Weavers began selling everything in their home. Sarah said that she could remember the television going away because her mother believed that it was a form of idolatry to watch television, that they started living without electricity. They only had running water, and they began to sell everything they could get their hands on. By this time, Randy had been laid off from his job, so he was working odd jobs. They were throwing every bit of money they could into purchasing, in 1983, because they really believed the 80s were the last decade of existence. They bought a 20 acres of land in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, and began taking trips up there to build a cabin. They were living in a tent on the property, and Vicky and Randy, along with the help of their children, actually built a cabin from scratch on this property with no electricity, no running water. They dug their own well. They built a couple of storage sheds. They started moving everything from their home in Iowa that they had not sold, all the food that they had stockpiled, all the weapons they had stockpiled. They began moving it to what was essentially a compound at Ruby Ridge near Naples, Idaho.
Don't shoot me down. Don't shoot me down. Don't shoot me down.
By 1983, they were fully moved in. They also started, how can I say this? There was a local branch of the Aryan Nation that also had a compound in the same area. And out of a need for social interaction, the Weavers started attending some of the activities that the Aryan Nation had going on, and they made friends. Though they didn't ever actually join it, they did believe in some of the things that the Aryan Nation said. Randy Weaver was quoted as saying he believes there's bad people and good people in every race, but he was against racial mixing. He said he felt it brought down the integrity of a racial class. He did believe that it was white people that were the true descendants of Adam and Seth, and that the Jews and any non-white race were the descendants of Cain, and therefore cursed. Yeah, pretty much a white supremacist. Oh, Lord. I have no problem with people being separatists. If you want to go build a compound somewhere in the mountains and live off the grid, more power to you. I wouldn't mind doing that myself sometimes. But it's always other weird stuff that gets mixed in with that, it seems. White supremacy, an apocalyptic view of the world. Just all this dark stuff gets mixed into just what could be a solitary lifestyle for somebody that's an introvert like myself. And it gets mixed in with all this other crap. So I always find this weirdness. But even though they lived on 20 acres that kind of, was apart from the town of Naples, Idaho, they did have to go into Naples from time to time to, buy supplies and stuff like that. And they did meet people. Among them was a nearby neighbor by the name of Terry Kennison. And Randy was wanting to expand his land and wanted to purchase some more land from Terry. And they had agreed on the purchase of a couple of acres for around $3,000. It's a lot of money in 1984. But there was a property dispute over it, and eventually it went to court, which Kennison actually lost. And it was at that time, in late 1984, that he started writing letters to the FBI, the Secret Service, the ATF, any other federal branch of government that would listen to him, alleging that Weaver was an ardent white supremacist. He was threatening to overthrow the government. He had planned to assassinate everybody from Pope John Paul II to President Reagan. Now, that was huge because Reagan had somebody take a pot shot at him not long after being elected to get the admiration of one Jodie Foster, but we won't get into that. It's one of the first tragedies I remember on television. Anybody else remember that? And he even said that he threatened to kill Idaho Governor John Evans. Weaver to this day denies those allegations, that he never once said or thought that or wrote it down or anything of the like. Also, neighbors, because of Kinnison, neighbors started to kind of look at them as interlopers, that everybody was kind of scared of them. Now, the children did wander the compound with guns. They would guard the perimeter of the compound, and there was a rumor that they had even ran somebody off the road, a single mom and her kids, and threatened the mother in front of her kids. Again, the Weavers deny if this ever happened. But Randy Weaver did admit that he taught his kids to hunt. He taught them to use guns, and he did teach them to walk the perimeter of their compound. But nearby neighbors would call them little Nazi soldiers. And even though they did associate with these Aryan people, he said they never actually joined. And ironically, it was a part of this Aryan Nation chapter that actually separated from the rest of the group, calling themselves the Order. And they were actually arrested and convicted of killing a Jewish journalist in Denver, burning down his synagogue. And yeah, if you don't remember my video on the Turner Diaries, I'm going to link it above. They called themselves the Order in there as well. So obviously the Turner Diaries, like with Timothy McVeigh, had some influence on this whole thing. But yeah. Because of Kinnison's allegations and the fact that the FBI and the ATF had informants inside the white supremacist group, and knew that Weaver had attended many of their functions, decided to engage in a full-fledged investigation of the Weavers in 1985. So the FBI and the Secret Service began an official investigation. They called the Weavers in on February 12th. And they were interviewed by 2 Secret Service and 2 FBI agencies, as well as a Boundary County sheriff and his chief investigators. They questioned them about their membership in the Aryan Nation. He questioned the large amount of weapons and ammunition they had stockpiled at their home. And Weaver denied being an actual member of the Aryan Nation. He said he did visit them for social situations. He did have friends up there, but he was not a member. They did have a stockpile of weapons, but it was for the protection of their property. And because there was actually no laws being broke, the government let them go with absolutely no charges filed. As you can imagine, all these things didn't sit well in the paranoid mind of Randy and Vicky. And on February 28th, they filed official affidavit at the nearby Idaho County Courthouse, one of the nearby county courthouses, alleging that personal enemies, aka Kinnison, were plotting to provoke the FBI into attacking and killing the Weaver family. So they asked for an order of protection, which was not granted. On May 6th, Randy and Vicky Weaver sent President Reagan a letter claiming that their enemy, Kinnison, may have sent Reagan a threatening letter under a forged signature. Reagan of course, never responded, but basically there was this whole fever building over a conspiracy between the United States government and the Weavers. Now, along with the Secret Service and the FBI, having investigated him in 1986, the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms got involved as they were attempting to investigate Frank Knick, who was the leader of this Aryan Nation white supremacist group. They were actually there investigating him under suspicion of illegal weapons running. And while there, one of their informants met Randy Weaver. This was actually one of Randy Weaver's first meetings at this particular group. And over the course of the next 3 years, he and the informant became good friends. And the informant told him that he was a gun smuggler and kind of enticed Randy Weaver into what he said was a counteroffensive against the Zionist organized government, or the United States government, and kind of enticed Weaver into helping him find weapons for their counteroffensive. And in October of 1989, Weaver sold the informant 2 sawed-off shotguns. Private sale of guns was not illegal, nor was it illegal, especially in the state of Idaho. What was illegal was the fact that the sawed-off portion made them shorter than legally allowed by the government, and that was the official charge. So he was officially served with a summons and for illegal tampering with firearms. And in June of 1990, an ATF agent by the name of Barely attempted to use the charges as leverage to turn Randy Weaver into an informant to inform on the Aryan Nation. Weaver said, "You can go to hell, I'm not a snitch." And as a result, the ATF officially filed those gun charges in June of 1990. The actual charge claimed that Weaver was a bank robber with criminal convictions, which was not true. And later on, in a 1995 Senate investigation, this was found that this was completely fabricated. But at the time, a federal grand jury did believe what the agents were saying, and Weaver was officially indicted December of 1990 for making and possessing, not for selling, illegal weapons. So it was the sawing off of the guns that was the charge, not actually selling, because private sales of firearms are perfectly legal. Now, there's a whole lot of rigmarole that goes on about these charges, but mainly, to me, it was a trumped-up charge. He sawed off some shotguns. No big whoop, in my opinion, but whatever. They were indicted for it. On February 5th, though, the ATF, not wanting to go into a standoff situation with the Weavers, actually decided that they would lure Vicky and Randy off their property and make the official arrest. So, January of 1991, ATF agents posed as broken down motorists and arrested Vicky and Randy when they attempted to stop to help, and they were placed in custody. They were told at that time their trial would begin February 19th, 1991, and they were allowed out on bail. They were also assigned a court-appointed attorney by the name of Everett Hoffmeister, who would be their main go-between. Everett Hoffmeister sent them several letters saying, "Let's plan your defense." But the date of their initial hearing was changed several times. Between February and February, it was supposed to be originally 19th to 20th, but then it was changed again. And there was a mix-up with the letters. The letters were sent to Hoffmeister, not the Weavers. And so, boil it down to what happened. Randy Weaver missed his initial court hearing, and a warrant was sworn for his arrest. And so the ATF, not being a true law enforcement, arrest type, basically because he had a bench warrant, now he's turned over to the U.S. Marshals. So he's been through the Secret Service, the FBI, the ATF, and now we're on to the U.S. Marshals. And the U.S. Marshals decided not to try to execute on the warrant until after March of 1991. And that attempt went to them actually taking up positions around their Ruby Ridge compound. And trying to get them to peacefully surrender. They would not. And they also noted from their hiding places that anytime anybody would approach the house, that the entire family and now friend Kevin Harris, a 21-year-old boy that didn't have much going on in his life, and the Weavers took him in, would take up positions with guns outside the property. And they knew that this was going to be explosive. So they began what would end up being several months of surveillance of the Weavers, trying to find a way to get in there peacefully. And along these months, they were actually building what is called a threat source file on the Weavers, which is basically a psychological profile of an assailant or somebody that is accused of a crime. And because of everything, the letters to Reagan, what Kinnison said, the supposed or alleged confrontations with neighbors, their huge stockpile of weapons, the fact they lived without electricity, that all this stuff, their affiliation with the white Aryan nation. They basically considered them very dangerous potential threats to the domestic security of the United States. A family of 6 people.
I got a wife and kids on Ruby Ridge. Please don't shoot me down. They killed my good dog. They killed my boy.
Weaver, of course, wasn't helping matters by very publicly stating he would kill anybody that set foot on his property. And of course, the media got a hold of it, and you know how the media is. Things got out of hand really quickly, with every talk show in the country wanting to get the Weavers on their show. In fact, you had Geraldo Rivera actually sending a helicopter from one of his shows, Now It Can Be Told, over the Weaver compound on April 18th, 1992. Well, the Weavers, hearing the helicopter, had no idea it was Geraldo and thought it was probably the government, came out and they all started taking pot shots at the helicopter. Well, as you can imagine, Geraldo's cameraman got everything on tape, and it was the talk of the town, the talk of the country for several weeks. And finally, it was decided that the U.S. Marshals would have to go in forcibly and take Randy Weaver out. And they began to put together a plan that would take place August 21st to 22nd, 1992. And this operation was called Operation Northern Exposure. 6 U.S. Marshals were sent to scout the area around the Ruby Ridge compound. They were in full military camouflage. They were equipped with night vision goggles, M16s. Among them were Art Roderick, Larry Cooper, Bill Deegan, who were the early reconnaissance team. And then they were flanked by David Hunt, Joseph Thomas, and Frank Norris, who manned the observation posts that they had around the mountains around the cabin. They were also flanked out on the road by hundreds of protesters, hundreds of pro-libertarian, pro-right-wing protesters that had taken up spots that on the road, saying, "Leave the Weavers alone." They're not doing anything wrong, as well as United States National Guardsmen, and military reservists who were trying to keep the peace, as well as all the media was there as well. What I'm about to tell you is from Agent Cooper's eventual testimony at the congressional hearings that followed the Ruby Ridge incident, and it's going to kind of space out the events of August 21st, August 22nd. Now remember, because the Weavers had basically sequestered themselves for months, almost a year now, supply of food was starting to run kind of low. And they had taken to night hunting, trying to find meat, because they couldn't go into town to get supplies, obviously. And all the food that they had stored up in Iowa was all but gone. So they were basically pretty hungry in there. And so they were also probably not as cautious as they needed to be. I just wanted to point that out. So, according to Cooper, surveillance began at 4:30 a.m. on August 21st, 1992. As the day drew on, they wanted to see what the family would do if they heard noise, and they started throwing rocks at the buildings on the property just to see what would happen. After one of the agents threw a particularly large rock that hit a shed, the Weavers' yellow lab, Stryker, came running out of the house, barking, and took off into the woods. Now, the reconnaissance men, who were Cooper, Roderick, and Deegan, were already out in the woods, and of course Stryker heard them as well and set off after them. Now, the marshals that were observing had no idea what was going on. All they saw was the dog streak off toward the woods where the reconnaissance team was, and then right after them was 14-year-old Sammy Weaver with a rifle, followed by Kevin Harris, followed by Randy Weaver himself into the woods. Now, according to the Weavers, they thought maybe Stryker had heard a elk or a deer or something, and they were starving, so they were hoping they were able to get some game. They had no idea the marshals were out there. So there's basically this whole chase scene through the woods with the marshals and then the dog and then the Weavers and Harris. And the marshals, Cooper said, they tried their best to avoid a firefight. But when the woods kind of gave way to an open field, they felt that the jig was up. They were going to be seen. And they basically, two of the marshals, Cooper and Deegan, basically stopped, yelled, "Stop, U.S. Marshals, put down your weapons." But either Harris and Sammy Weaver did not hear them, or they didn't care to obey. And the marshals at this time took aim at the people and dogs running toward them. Both agents yelled halt. Nobody halted, so they took a shot at Harris, who was kind of flipping his rifle up. Harris hit the ground to avoid the shot, and then the chase kind of continued. A few minutes later, they thought they had gotten away, but here comes Stryker, the dog, and they really thought that Stryker was going to give up their position. So they took Roderick's shot and killed the dog. And unfortunately, about the time he did that, Sammy Harris came bursting out of around the bend, saw his dog get shot. Of course, it angered the young 14-year-old man, and he started screaming, "You killed my dog, you son of a bitch." And he immediately pulled up his rifle and took shots at both Roderick and Cooper. All the agents started returning fire. About this time, Sammy had turned and was running back toward Kevin Harris and then his father, who was coming out of the woods at the time. And one of the agents killed Sammy Weaver, shot him in the back. He died immediately. Harris then fired at Deputy Deegan, killing him instantly. Later, a ballistics report would reveal that 19 rounds were fired in total in that entire exchange. Roderick fired 1 shot from his M16. Deegan fired 7 from his M16. Cooper fired 6 from his 9mm Colt submachine gun. Sammy Weaver fired 3 from his Ruger Mini 14, and Harris fired 2 from his M1917 Enfield. Later revealed that the fatal shot to Sammy Weaver was fired by Agent Cooper, as well as the fatal shot to Deegan was fired by Kevin Harris. But basically the Weavers and Harris, they grabbed Sammy's body and they drug him back into the woods, back toward the cabin. And, of course, immediately told the rest of the family what had happened. And they took Sammy's body, they cleaned it, they prepared it, and they put it in one of their storage sheds. They had a storage shed out back that also had a bed in it for guests or whatever, and they actually put Sammy's body wrapped in a blanket out in another part of the compound. Conflicting tales. The Weavers say that the agent shot the dog, then shot at them first, and they returned fire. Whereas the agent said that Kevin Harris and Sammy Weaver opened fire first after the dog had been shot. And so no one really knows. It was just a bad situation for sure. And of course, the siege dug in even more after that happened. The U.S. Marshal Chief Dave Hunt requested backup from Idaho law enforcement, as well as the FBI, and of course more military came in, as well as once news got out that a 14-year-old boy had been shot and killed. As you can imagine, protesters came in from all over. There were actually children walking around down on the road with handmade targets on them with the question, "Am I next?" And pretty much everything had kind of broken down, and then now they finally get military support in the way of observers, hostage negotiators, and snipers. And for over almost 11 days, the siege continued on. The FBI entered a special orders called the ROE, broken down into 4 parts in dealing with this siege as it got more and more out of hand. And these are the 4 things that their ROE stipulated. If any adult in the area around the cabin is observed with a weapon after any surrender announcement has been made, deadly force could and should be used to neutralize the individual. If any adult male is observed with a weapon prior to the announcement of deadly force, can and should be employed and should be shot, if at all possible, without endangering children. If compromised by any dog, the dog can be taken out. Any subjects other than Randy Weaver, Vicky Weaver, Kevin Harris presenting a threat of death or grievous bodily harm, deadly force can be imposed. So basically, shoot anything that moves except for children. So, as I said, the entire siege took 11 days, but it only took to the second day, August 22nd, after Sammy's death on the 21st, where actual military snipers were deployed to the house to keep observance with the rules I just read you in mind. So they did completely surround the cabin. Military snipers as well as FBI SWAT teams watching for any movement. As you can imagine, no one was coming out of the cabin until later that day when Randy Weaver decided he wanted to go spend some time with his son, whose body was laying out in the storage shed. Did come out and went into the shed. He spent some time with his son. He came out. He did have a weapon with him. And as soon as a sniper saw him, they took those orders to heart and fired at Randy Weaver, hitting him in the arm and also shooting into the shed. It was at this time that 16-year-old Sarah came running out as her father ran toward her, telling her to get back in the house. About this time, Kevin Harris had run out to try to help Randy, and one single solitary shot rang out from a military sniper, striking Kevin Harris in the chest, and probably one of the more tragic events of this entire siege. This same bullet ricocheted and hit Vicky Weaver in the head, who was standing in the doorway shouting for them to get back in the house while holding their 10-month-old baby, Elishaba. And Vicky fell dead immediately. Immediately, the Weavers and Harris drug her back into the house. They boarded it up, and they knew immediately she was dead. Kevin Harris was near death, having taken a shot to the chest. It's later determined that it was a bullet from FBI sharpshooter Lon Horici, who shot Harris and killed Vicky Weaver. And he said that he did it because he believed they were going to shoot at the surveillance helicopter. But eventually, on August 30th, thanks to help from a right-wing presidential candidate by the name of Bo Gritz, who could empathize with what the Weavers and Harris was going through, and he actually walked up to the property and had a conversation with the Weavers and convinced them to surrender on August 30th. Now, on August 23rd, he and Harris had actually been charged with several federal crimes, including the murder of a U.S. Marshal, and they were taken into custody as soon as they left the compound and walked down with Bo Gritz. The federal government actually considered charging Sarah, who was 16, as an adult, but they could never prove that she had fired a shot, which she didn't. And so her and the 10-month-old baby were released to the custody of relatives, while her father and Kevin Harris were held under federal bench warrant. The outcome of their trials, Weaver was, all the charges against Weaver were actually dropped, except for the original, missing his original court date and violating his bail conditions. He served 18 months for that. And Kevin Harris was acquitted of all charges given the extenuating circumstances of what was going on. And then the congressional hearings began, dipping into FBI misconduct, the shoot on sight rule, all these other things that were done kind of contrary to normal federal police procedure. And let's just say that a couple of high-ranking members of the FBI were eventually demoted. Some were fired, and rules were changed to prevent a shoot on shoot to kill mentality for future sieges. And this is where you see the onset of modern day hostage negotiation tactics, which are usually results in more people making it out of a situation alive. And in addition, civil suits in the amount of $200 million for the wrongful death of Sammy and Vicki Weaver were filed by Weaver on behalf of his daughters, and the court, this was settled out of court. The government never admitted any wrongdoing, but did pay a settlement of $100,000 to Randy Weaver, and each of his 3 remaining daughters received $1 million. Harris had also sued, and eventually Harris was awarded $380,000 from the federal government as well. The Weavers later moved to Montana, where the family still lives today. They became born-again mainstream Christians, and Sarah Weaver said in 2012 she forgave the agents who killed her mother and her brother. Basically, this was an American tragedy. Several movies made about it, songs, and it's become kind of a rallying point for the separatist libertarian type movement. I have mixed feelings on Ruby Ridge. I really don't think there was very much of a crime ever committed. Yes, they were white supremacists. They were not the best people, but yet they were living apart from everyone else. They didn't want anything to do with anybody else. Just live and let live. There was no need for, first of all, needless deaths of an agent and the Weavers, plus the millions of dollars wasted on this fiasco when it was just for selling 2 sawed-off shotguns. Why didn't they just drop the charges? I think this was a little bit of government overreach. There's a lot of government overreach in this. It was basically, I think they were mad at Weaver because he did not become a narc, and they wanted to punish him. And I think in the end, they got punished, but at the cost of a mother and a brother. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I will be back soon with another true crime case, as well as some more Daybell novels. And I hope you're having a very nice holiday season. Until next time, Keto and Krime.